Hello and welcome to today's webinar, What Information Managers Can Learn from Marie Kondo, How to Tidy Up Workplace Clutter. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. If you're interested in trying out the enterprise version of Harmony, please send us a request in the chat window and someone will contact you after the webinar to get you started. We'll also make a recording of the webcast available to you within a couple of days. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers, David Lavender, Harmony Chief Product Officer, and Richard Poole, Chief Technology Officer of EMEA at Harmony. David has served as an executive in enterprise software, mobility, security, and networking companies. David is an international scholar for the Society for the History of Technology, a founding member of the Humanizing the Digital Workplace Consortium, and a longtime contributor to CMS Wire. Richard heads up the pre-sales team for Harmony across the EMEA and Asia Pacific regions, working both directly with key accounts as well as Harmony's partner channel. Bringing with him almost 20 years of experience in data management systems, Richard has helped many companies to realize the significant benefits in productivity that collaborative platforms enable. David, please get us started.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, so for those of you who have been living under a rock for the last few years, Marie Kondo should be pretty familiar to you. She's an expert at tidying up. She goes into people's houses and helps them declutter. So while it may not be immediately apparent or obvious, there's a lot in common that what Marie Kondo does and what we need to be doing as information managers in the workplace, helping our organizations declutter their information mess. So the basic problem is getting control of stuff. At home, we collect too much junk, but it's really not that much different at work. At work, okay, so the clutter's not caused by piles of old VHS cassettes or old college sweatshirts. Rather, it's caused by a continuously expanding collection of emails and documents. But make no mistake, at work, we have the same problem with hoarding that we have at home. It's the same root cause that people have trouble of letting things go. So at home, the clutter often leads to chaotic lifestyle and increased stress, leading to that feeling of being overwhelmed. And at work, on the other hand, keeping too much stuff leads to an increased risk of liability. It also adds to high storage cost, and it adds to existing work stress, because when you can't find what you want when you need it, it becomes very stressful. Maria's been super successful at helping people bring order and happiness to their homes and lives. So let's see how the principles she's made famous can be applied to tidying up the workplace information clutter. Let's start with a quick poll question.
So before we get started, what's your biggest stumbling block to tidying up workplace clutter? Is it knowing where to start with your emails documents? Is it deleting your old, trivial, redundant emails? Or having a practical policy stating what needs to be saved and classified? Or worrying about deleting things needed for records and compliance? And let's see where most of our audience is today. Wow, okay. It's neck and neck. All right, David, I'm going to show the results.
Okay, so interesting. It's almost evenly split across all the four categories, with deleting redundant, old, and trivial emails a little bit ahead than the others. But it looks like all these things are challenges. So that's great. Marie has some advice for us on all of these. So let's dive right in. So with Marie's 6 rules, let's start with rule number 1 and see how this applies to information managers. First rule is commit yourself. So to tidying up. There's an ancient proverb that says, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that means any meaningful change requires that commitment to get started. And without this being committed, nothing positive is going to happen. That's equally true for information and records management projects as well. You need to dedicate the time, the effort, the skill to solving the problem. So here's what you need to get focused. First of all, you need to take ownership. So dealing with this clutter or retaining too much stuff is not a legal department's problem or a compliance department problem. It's really an organizational problem. It's a business problem. And one key point to note is that the compliance people look at keeping too much stuff much differently than business workers do. Compliance folks are always interested in getting rid of as much as possible because that reduces liability. But business managers and everyday knowledge workers need to keep information. They want to keep information to run the business. Oftentimes, not knowing what you're going to need in the future, we like to keep everything. That's where the problem starts. On the other hand, compliance managers don't know what we need to retain, so it's hard for them to give us good guidelines of what needs to be kept and what doesn't need to be kept. Because there's a big difference also between what compliance people consider as what they would call a record or what business people would call a business record, something that's needed to support ongoing business, like email inquiries from clients asking for advice, that kind of thing. Those emails need to be available to colleagues so they can be completely up to date before stepping in and offering advice to people. So those are really important to keep around. So in most companies, if the initiative is assigned to only one of these groups, it never solves the problem. If you really want to solve the problem, you have to engage both with the people responsible for the compliance or records management and also key people in the business units. Rule number 2 from Marie. Imagine your ideal lifestyle. Well, at home, this is kind of simple. It just means visualizing what a decluttered world would look like. You know, when she goes into the garage and kind of that vision of what that place would look like with all the junk piled up around it. So that's kind of really the idea here is to psych yourself up for that task ahead. And at work, it's not really different psychologically, although the steps are a little bit different. At work, you need to paint the picture of what that successful initiative is going to deliver the organization. You got to get people excited, get them pumped up, get them eager to pitch in and help make that project a success. And you can do that by creating a map of how you can achieve practical reduction of emails and documents. And really the key thing is, you ever noticed how people will do the right thing if it's easy enough? So if you just ask people to do something simple, the whole nudge theory of psychology is based on this. If you ask them to do something which is easy enough, they'll do it. But if you ask them to do things that are complicated, they will definitely find ways to circumvent all the requests and directives that you give them. So at the end of the day, what people want to do is they want to focus on their day job. They don't care really about managing emails and documents. So if you make the right thing the easy thing to do by keeping policies simple, and any step that you ask them to do is reduced to 1 or 2, even single step would be even best. That would be the way to do it. So make a single step for folks to move an email, so for example, from their inbox, and apply a simple label or metadata. Anything more than that, and your project is really going to be doomed. Definitely don't want doom in a project. Let's move on to rule number 3. Rule number 3, Marie says, finish discarding first. Before you can expect to see an improvement in order, you need to eliminate massive amounts of clutter. That's true at work, it's true at home. So the important thing is to just start throwing things out right away. We've seen a number of things that work for information managers in the workplace. For example, setting a default policy for emails and documents to be deleted after a specific amount of time is a good one. Some companies do 6 months, 90 days is another one. That's a popular one. And after that time period, emails and documents disappear unless the business knowledge worker takes some active step to retain the content. This gets the business workers engaged and thinking about what they need to be doing. Secondly, you can direct folks to move emails out of their inbox to a shared space like Microsoft Teams or SharePoint. If you're performing a file migration project, you can direct workers to move files from shared drives or cloud storage to a single platform, again, like Teams or SharePoint. Let workers know that they have, for example, a limited amount of time, say 3 months, to move all their emails and documents that they're going to need going forward, and then the old stuff disappears. So it's basically they have to do something, or else poof, the stuff disappears. And once they realize that if they don't do something, they're not going to have their materials, you will see magically how all of a sudden things start to move. Rule number 4, Marie says, tidy by category, not by location. So at home, again, this makes intuitive sense. Organize your closets by related items, all your old team jerseys, hats, regalia, that kind of stuff. Put it in the top shelves of different closets. And all your Hawaiian shirts, Bermuda shorts, and Havana hats maybe on the bottom shelves. At work, it's no different with content, really. If you're working on a project, you need to uniformly organize all your emails, documents, and team conversations related to the same project, even though those items may be stored in different apps like Exchange, SharePoint, and Teams. So Harmony is introducing what we call descriptive labels, which are Office 365 metadata that can be used to detail the contents of email, documents, or team conversations. And then these labels can be applied to emails in a way that's similar to how you apply SharePoint metadata to documents. Richard will show us this briefly in how this works. It goes without saying that when you understand what emails and documents represent, it's much easier to deal with them. So it's really important to take advantage of labels to define a retention schedule and also to categorize information by subject. So you're going to need to define clear policies for all the kinds of information that you need to work with. And that obviously starts with emails and then documents, but you'll probably want to consider collaboration policy for other stuff like team conversations as well. As once you have your information organized by content, you'll be able to search and filter it so you can find that stuff later on. And that's really critical for information management. Rule number 5, Marie's advice, follow the right order. So this point is particularly important. So with home clutter, you want to make sure that the main living quarters are taken on before you attempt to tidy up a basement or a garage. And that's no different than with content in the workplace. Email is by far the biggest and most visible problem that most companies have. With hundreds of emails pouring in each day per person, they pile up quickly. Let's just do a quick calculation. Consider that if everyone in a 1,000 employee company gets about 50 emails a day, and that's a pretty low number for most companies. What that tallies to is about 13 million emails in a year. So if you kept everything in a company like that, you'd have a massive problem. And of course, this compounds it over time, over years. So what you need to do is start eliminating email clutter first, then take on the documents afterwards, whose problem is not as much a problem of volume of having too many documents, but having too many versions of them floating around and not knowing which one is the latest version of the credible and official version of the document. And then later on, you can take on things like team conversations. And finally, rule number 6 for Marie. Marie says, ask yourself if it sparks joy. So at home, reducing clutter and tidying up is all about happiness. You feel joy when things are organized and clean, when they're orderly. At work, the story is a little bit different. It's not so much about clean, it's about being effective, productive, and stress-free. Ask yourself, are you satisfied with what you have now, how the situation is now? Are you compliant with good governance practices? Can you find what you need in a reasonable amount of time? And have you reduced the stress associated with not being able to find what you need? So this is the kind of question you need to ask yourself. If your efforts are helping you achieve compliance, productivity, and peace of mind, then surely it will lead to joy. And to actually see how we implement this great advice, I'm going to turn it back over to Richard. But before we do that, Susan is going to run another quick poll of the audience.
Thank you, David. So after that, I would like to know, how are you currently storing your important business emails? Are you storing them in Exchange, in SharePoint? Are you using Microsoft Teams, another document management system, or you're right now looking for a new solution? Where to store? Presentation. And while you're doing that, we're going to see if Richard is starting to set up his presentation for you.
Yep. Okay, so we've got just looking at the poll results. We've got let's see, about 65% in Exchange, storing emails, 35% in SharePoint. That's quite high. It's more than I would have expected. 15% already in Microsoft Teams. That's a really high number. And 15% is looking for a new solution. So with that, it gives us some good good background. And maybe with that, Richard, take it away and show us how this works.
Yeah, thanks for that. Obviously, background about how Marie kind of recommends to tidy up and declutter and things. And obviously, Harmony has always given you a way to easily capture, classify, discover, and share content in SharePoint. But I think, as things evolve, and for example, the introduction of Teams into the Office 365 portfolio, there's many different ways to actually address that problem, and it's not necessarily just putting everything into SharePoint, but it could be putting emails into a shared mailbox, for example, or a group mailbox in a team, and the documents in the associated SharePoint sites with a team. So let's have a look at some new capabilities that we're going to be introducing in Harmony in the next version. And if we just take a look at my Outlook environment here. So as I guess, some of the audience may be customers or people who have seen Harmony before or used Harmony. It's basically an interface into your Office 365 space to allow you to capture content from Outlook, from Windows Explorer, into OneDrive, Teams, and SharePoint sites. A nice, easy, intuitive interface, and giving the power to the end user to actually do the capturing and the organizing of the content, but also supporting metadata in SharePoint. But as David described, the landscape is evolving at the moment, and Teams is really becoming a point of interest, and people are kind of seeing how they can utilize Teams to collaborate and organize their content, because Teams kind of brings together a few different areas of Office 365 and presents them to you, for example, in the Teams interface. So I can, create teams and channels and things within that UI, and when I create a team, it actually creates a SharePoint site, a conversation channel, and a group mailbox as well. So you can kind of interact and collaborate in one kind of interface. But there's a bit of a disconnect between those three areas of, if I want to get to the mailbox of a particular team, then I have to go to Outlook and I have to kind of expand that as a group mailbox, and there's limitations on how that can actually help people to collaborate, because it's really a bit more of a kind of a view on a mailbox rather than the same capabilities as you have in your own personal interface. So with the new version of Harmony that we'll be introducing, we'll be giving you the option to actually not just use SharePoint, which you can continue to do as well, but also utilize the Teams kind of infrastructure and the back end of that as well to store the content in the right places, but bring together the content with the kind of corresponding and contextual information. So to actually categorize the content so that the user doesn't necessarily need to know that an email is in a mailbox or a document is in a SharePoint site, but actually be able to navigate across them in a single interface. So for example, here, I'm a member of a number of teams, and I can see that I've got a number of channels that have been created under some of those teams as well. So if I've got an email here that I want to retain, I don't want it to be deleted from my mailbox automatically, because it might be, we've put in a retention policy on people's mailboxes that says, emails that are older than 3 months old will be automatically deleted, for example. So I actually need to retain this email because it relates to an important project that I'm working on. So with Harmony and the Smart Assistant that we're going to be adding, I can drag that email onto, for example, a channel in a team. And what that's going to do is it's going to put a copy of that email in the team mailbox, but I've also got the ability to utilize any of the metadata that's defined in the associated SharePoint library as well. So this is really adding an extra layer of categorization and the ability to search and filter and things based on that metadata that's coming from SharePoint being extended to a group mailbox in Exchange. So we can see here, okay, I want to tag this as to do with management. And so I'm going to apply that metadata, or what we're calling descriptive labels, to the content in SharePoint and the content in Exchange. But I also want to actually post an update in Teams that I've actually saved that email to the team, and then I can continue to have internal dialogue within the kind of Teams interface as well. So if I now go to that particular channel, I can see that that email I've just saved has been associated with the team. It's actually in the team mailbox, but it's also visible to the rest of the team. So, for example, I can start a conversation, or I can reply to that to say that this needs some discussion. So it's bringing together kind of the external communication that you receive on a daily basis by email. Like David said, you know, like even a very conservative analysis would be like you're getting kind of 50 emails a day. And some of those are important emails that you then want to discuss, but you don't want to add more email dialogue internally. It's very useful to be able to then discuss that, that email internally using Teams. Now, what if I've got an email that actually has a document associated with it as well? So in the same way, if I just drag and drop that email into the same channel as we did before, I'm going to go through the same process, but in this case, it's actually doing two or three separate things. It's capturing the email and putting it into that mailbox like we just saw a moment ago, but it's also capturing the document and putting it into SharePoint. I'm applying the metadata, those descriptive tags, across both of those items, and I'm creating a link between the two. So now if I save that to the channel and post it as an update, then again, if we just go back to that channel view, we'll see now that I've got the email like we did before, and I can click to open that up from Outlook. So you can see it's stored as exactly as it was received, but in this case, it's actually replaced the attachment with a link to the document in SharePoint. So it's really getting people to put the right content in the right places, but from a user's point of view, they're doing it very, very intuitively and very easily, because I'm just dragging it to a team channel. Now, if I want to go and take a closer look at some of the content that's in that channel, I can simply just double click on the channel name there, and you'll see that we have like a navigation view that's bringing together that metadata that we applied to the content. So for example, here, I can see items that have been tagged for this particular project in this team, are the two emails that we've just captured and the associated attachment. But I can also see the other content in that team. So for example, there might be some content here, some other emails that were actually captured against a different channel or with different metadata. And I can then use that metadata to filter and navigate the common content, even though they're in different repositories and different parts of the team, for example. So it's nice and easy to bring together and discover the content that people are working with and get it out of your mailbox, get it out of your personal interface, so that it can, you know, retention policies can be applied to the whole environment really. Because if I actually have a look at the SharePoint, the associated SharePoint library that was created against this particular channel, if I just right click on there and choose to open the SharePoint location in Harmony, you'll see the documentation that is being saved against that particular channel, so that contract that we received. And we'll see also the metadata that was applied to it. But from here, I can also able to work on that content directly. So I can check in, check out, approve, reject, all those kind of things. I can see the version history, but I can also apply a retention label. So it might be, actually, this document needs to be retained for a particular period of time. So for example, this is a contract, so it needs to be stored for, let's say, or it's sensitive, so it needs to be stored for a period of time. So once I apply that label is now visible on the item, but also it's being used. So if somebody tries to, for example, delete that item, they won't be able to, because that retention policy is being applied to that particular item in this document library. So that kind of gives you a bit of an overview of what we're introducing in the next version of Harmony, above and beyond and alongside the functionality that you already know and love about the Harmony products.
Okay, and with that, Richard, let's ask the last question. While asking the last question, I will ask the questions that you have been asking. Okay, so the first question I think is for you, David. Practically speaking, how do I get started decluttering my environment?
Okay, thanks, Susan. So yeah, again, going back to Marie's advice, there's several procedural steps that need to be taken, as well as also looking at some of the technology. So let's start with the procedural steps. First of all, you need to scope out the project and get the both the technical and the business users on board. I think, again, as I said before, one of the biggest failings if projects fail is it's either seen as a compliance or some sort of a records project as an IT task, and the business users are left out, and there's really very little, the what's in it for me is missing for the business users. On the technology side, I think the big thing is to make it easy. If you make things difficult for people, they will find a way to circumvent what you're asking them to do. I think, as Richard showed, the way to do this is to reduce the amount of toggling between apps that you need to do in order to keep all your Office 365 information in one place, keep the interface neat and clean, not have to jump between email and Teams. I think Teams, as Richard said, is of course becoming very popular and something people are extremely interested in using. So tying all that together has to be super easy. So dragging and dropping, applying descriptive labels, being able to filter on those labels, find information. Those are really key for a successful project.
Thank you, David. The next question I see is someone's asking, have we replaced topics with teams? Maybe Richard?
Yeah, so I mean, the topics concept that we were introducing previously is not gone away completely. It's kind of evolved into those descriptive labels that we demonstrated can be applied to the content, whether it's in SharePoint or in Exchange. But it's keeping it firstly client side, so that it's actually reading the existing metadata as topics, if you like, from the SharePoint site that's associated with the team. We are obviously utilizing Teams heavily as part of that, because we see that there's a lot of interest in people moving in that direction. But then we're also utilizing some of the kind of drill down topic interface that we'd implemented previously around that kind of using those descriptive labels to actually retrieve the information. So it's really an evolution of what we've been developing over the last year or two. And also, we haven't spoken about it too much today, but as a second step, next year we will be adding a machine learning and AI capability to utilize the behavior of the end users of what's being stored, what's being retained, what's being disposed of, to actually suggest to you, the end user, what type of content should be saved, maybe where it should be saved and whether it's already been saved, whether it's duplicated a number of times in different places. So we're utilizing what we've learned from the topics development that we've done to implement that in a few different areas over the course of the next kind of 6 months.
Thank you. How is what Harmony is offering different than what Microsoft provides out of the box?
So
Rich?
out of the box, yeah, thanks. So yeah, out of the box with Teams, obviously you have a one interface for the team. So if I don't know if I'm still sharing my screen, but if I go to, let's say, this kind of Teams interface here, it doesn't give you the ability really to capture content that you're receiving externally, let's say. So that existing content that you may already have in your mailboxes, on your desktop, or that you're receiving on a daily basis. I think, I think in an ideal world, Microsoft would like that everybody moves to Teams and uses that for all their communication from here on in. But the reality is that you do need to interact with people via email as well. So we're bringing that level of integration, but also extending the metadata, as I say, from SharePoint to the group mailbox in Exchange as well, which Teams doesn't do out of the box at all. Because if you, for example, store content in a team library in Teams, there's no real visibility of the metadata without going into SharePoint. But also, it's difficult to organize that content, and even in a group mailbox, there's no way to organize the content even by channel. The group mailbox is for the group, so you'll potentially end up, if you were to, for example, forward emails to the group mailbox, end up with a massive kind of mailbox with a load of emails in, but it's not very easy to navigate, so you can't search it very easily. You can't search across multiple teams, for example, from an email point of view. Whereas the Harmony kind of drill down interface for the team, it gives you that ability to navigate, but also filter and utilize the descriptive labels that we're adding, which are essentially SharePoint metadata.
Thank you, Richard. The next question is kind of a two-part question. Somebody's asking, do they need some specific setup to use the Teams functionality? And then when will this next version of Harmony be available?
Okay, so yeah, obviously I think the two are related. So yes, obviously you will need this new version of Harmony to utilize the new functionality I've been showing today, which is due to be released in early October. So it's fairly imminent. We're going through QA processes and finalizing things at the moment. So once you've got that installed, it's just a case of setting up a few options in the interface, but there's nothing additional that you need to configure or set up in Office 365, either in SharePoint, Exchange, or Teams. It will basically pick up the teams that you have access to. So for example, here I can see all of the teams and groups that I've got, along with the channels, and then I can choose whether I want to add those, which channels, which teams, to my kind of favorites interface. So we're kind of extending the favorites capabilities here to give you a focused view on the locations that you're going to work in on a regular basis. But in terms of configuration, additional kind of infrastructure, there's really nothing else that you need other than the new version of Harmony due for release next month.
Great, thank you so much. David, thank you for that presentation. Richard, thank you very much for that demonstration. Thank all of you for joining us today. As I said, you'll receive an email with a link to view the webinar again within a couple of days, and we look forward to meeting you again at our next webinar. Thank you.